Hello Repliters and welcome to Replit Pro, where we aim to 10x your workflow. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been doing a lot of work on AI recently, and I'm getting stuck with prompts. I'm very interested in prompt engineering, so rather than trying to make things up for myself, I found a chap who's very much in the know. This is Zahid, and he is our developer advocate, and he's going to talk to us today all about prompt engineering. Hi, Zahid.
Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. Super excited for this call. Thank you, David.
This is Zahid's first on-camera appearance for us, I believe. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, first one.
So you'll see a lot more of him in the coming weeks as he does content for developers and pros. But Zahid, let's get down to business. What is prompt engineering?
Prompt engineering is about getting the most value out of various different models. Now, for large language models, that means you're crafting the right prompt using the right vocabulary, the right sentence structure, things like that. But if you're generating images, a lot of the same principles apply. It just comes down to getting the most value out of the models, and you have to experiment with different types of wording, different types of structures to get the right results. And I'm going to be showing some really awesome examples of these real world examples of how you can use prompt engineering to build applications, to build logos, to generate music. So that's really cool as well. There's a lot of ways you can leverage this, and really excited to talk about it.
Great. I mean, one of my frustrations with prompt engineering is it does feel like you're throwing a paragraph of text at the AI and you're getting something back. And a paragraph of text in the normal literary world doesn't seem like a lot of effort, but there's so much effort that needs to go into a good prompt, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting because there are some prompts that I use in my day to day work and some of the projects I've done in the past where a prompt will be an entire paragraph long. And although it might not look like a lot, there were hours spent on optimizing the prompt to make sure that it works correctly. There are certain situations where, for some reason, the AI doesn't pick up on certain words. You have to use synonyms, for example. There are other times where you might feel like you're giving too much information, you don't have enough information. There's a lot of these different experiments you have to do. And sometimes the best results come from the most random prompts. One of the important things is how can we like increase the reliability of these things too. So it's definitely an important thing.
You've talked about synonyms there. I know you've talked to me before about how the image generation prompts sometimes have difficulty with the word beautiful. So, what do we do in that situation?
It's interesting because there have been situations where I'll use certain words. Like sometimes when people write prompts, they try to make things a little bit sophisticated. Like you might say, like aesthetically pleasing, for example, if you want something to look good. Sometimes that's not necessarily the best approach. It's sometimes easier and actually more effective to just use simple words like beautiful. You don't have to overcomplicate things all the time, but this is one of those situations where you have to experiment. And there are times where I'll get a mediocre result, but if I change just one or two words and I actually use the same meaning, but just different words for it, I end up getting substantially better results. So this just comes down to how the model is interpreting certain words based on its training data. And that the beauty thing I mentioned was just one example. There's a lot more, but really it just comes down to experimenting and seeing what works best for you.
Is it the case then that if I'm doing prompt engineering, I need to have a big vocabulary or a thesaurus to hand?
Vocabulary definitely helps. I would say the best prompt engineers are actually able to leverage their vocabulary and write all kinds of creative prompts using various different types of sentence structures, but also real world references. That's actually something I wanted to talk about. So there have been situations where I want something to look a certain way, but instead of explicitly giving the AI the colors, I'll make a reference to a real world object, to some kind of movie or something like that. For example, in one of the logos that I generated, which had green and blue, I didn't mention green or blue anywhere in the prompt. I made a reference to Northern Lights. And that was interpreted by the AI as green and blue. And that ended up making the logo so beautiful. And if you looked at the prompt, there wasn't a single mention of an explicit color. So, real world references do help a lot. And just having a good general base of knowledge of being able to, pick and choose which references you want in your prompt, that helps a lot. And you'll see this not just when working with language models, but also working with like diffusion models, like stable diffusion, generating images, those real world examples, and also with music generation, where you can refer to certain artists. But the only way you'll be able to do that effectively is if you have a solid base knowledge of who good artists are and the artists that you like, artists that you want inspiration from, so that you can use those references in your prompt.
Prompt engineering, then. There's an analogy you've given me before, which I'd like you to talk about here, because I think this is great and it really helped me understand what I was doing trying to construct those words and those phrases. And you called it the squeezing the orange analogy. Tell us all about that.
I love using that analogy. So essentially, if you have an orange and your goal is to juice the orange, your goal is to get as much juice out of it as possible. And if you're going to do that, you want to have the proper equipment, you want to use a proper machine. Sometimes when you're prompt engineering and you don't use a very good prompt, it's like juicing the orange with your hands. You might get some juice out of it, but it's not the most efficient way to do it. The idea is, how do you get every ounce of value out of a model? And if you have the right techniques and the right way of prompting the AI, you can get the most bang for your buck and basically get the maximum possible value that's possible based on the technology. But that requires a little bit of strategy, a little bit of effort. Because if you don't put enough effort into it, your results are not going to look very good. Garbage in, garbage out, right? So that's a common thing. So really the main thing is to just make sure that you're getting the most value, and that comes down to having the right prompt.
I'll give you an example from some work I've been doing recently, which is on a YouTube transcriber. And it would take in the transcript of the YouTube video, and I wanted it to produce like 1,000 word summary for me, so I didn't have to watch an hour and a half video essay on something just to get the point.
Right.
And I think I was squeezing that orange with one hand, because I was just saying, "Give me a summary," and every time I ran it, it would pick a different style. It would pick a different voice. Sometimes it would speak as if it was the person on the video. Sometimes it would try and go, the speaker is this, but it had so much difference every time I ran it, and it was so inconsistent. And then I took your words to heart and I started adding to it, adding in 1,000 words in the style of used third person. And then eventually I got to a point where actually I was getting 1,000 page summaries from GPT 3.5 and GPT 4 really, really quickly. So, I mean, absolutely bang on.
That's incredible. Thousands of pages.
Thousands of words.
Yeah, you'd be
Yeah.
surprised with these newer models, the 32K model. There's an incredible amount of context that you have, and you can get some really good results, especially with longer documents.
That's fantastic. One thing I wanted to ask you about was hallucinations, because occasionally I get these and I'm using something like ChatGPT. And the other day, actually, I was doing a Replit 101 live stream where somebody came with some code snippets they wanted fixed that turned out to just be a ChatGPT hallucination of a library that didn't exist. So, what are they, and how can we prevent getting them?
Yeah, so one of the things you'll notice when working with these models is a temperature parameter. Basically, if you want your output to be creative, for example, if you're writing a story, you're writing a poem or something like that, you'll want the temperature to be relatively higher. But if you're working with a use case that's a little bit more logical and requires less creativity, for example, coding, code generation is often done at a temperature of 0 because you don't want there to be too much creative input. It's mostly logic driven. But for things like stories, if you turn up the temperature, you'll notice the creativity starts to go up. And this often happens in weird ways. So if you're trying to complete a certain task, a hallucination is basically when the AI gets a little too creative and starts making things up and starts giving you information that is not true. It starts making references to things that don't exist. And a lot of times you can fix these hallucinations in two ways. Number one, turning down the temperature, but also in your prompt, you can actually add certain sentences, certain hints in your prompts. Like, for example, in one of the examples I'll show you, if you're not sure of the answer, just say, I don't know. This is actually something I have in one of the prompts that I designed for LangChain Chat, where we basically told the model, listen, only give an answer if you know the answer. If you don't, just be humble and say you don't know. We actually have that in the prompt, which is kind of hilarious if you think about it. But it works. It's effective. And there are various different prompt hacks that you can use to get the AI to go in a certain direction. And in the case of hallucinations, you can definitely prevent it from saying certain things in the prompt.
Well, with that in mind, should we take a look at some of the examples you brought with you?
Yeah, I was going to say this is such an awesome prompt. So we know that large language models are pretty good at generating code, but if you've used most chat assistants like Ghostwriter Chat or ChatGPT, it'll give you the code, but it's still up to you to actually take that code and paste it somewhere. So this was an attempt to basically automate the process of not just generating the code, but also placing that code into the correct files hands-free. That was the idea here. So you'll notice in this prompt, we start by setting the stage. We tell the model that you are a software engineer and you're given a description of an app. I refer to that as basically setting the stage. Then you include your request, which in this case, we're not just asking it to generate a bunch of code, we're asking it to generate a bash script. And that allows us to do a bunch of these system processes automatically. And in this case, we are initializing a brand new Next.js app with Tailwind CSS. It's going to initialize it, it's going to CD into the directory, it's going to go into the correct file, clear it out, take the code that it generated, paste it into the correct file, and then run the app automatically. And the reason we use Tailwind in this example is because we don't want to worry about managing a separate CSS file. By using Tailwind, it gives us kind of this all-in-one solution where we can generate all of the code for the component with the styling baked in and basically a single prompt.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes things very easy and convenient. So this particular example that we're looking at, if you look at the very bottom where it says description, that's actually where we provide our custom input. So this is the type of app that you want to create. So in this case, the description is a modern web client for Reddit. And it will generate a bash script that will create a new Next.js application from scratch and build you a Reddit client. And it does a lot of things behind the scenes that you don't have to explicitly tell it about. Like, for example, making an API call to pull in the data from Reddit. We didn't have to give it an API link or anything like that. It has a lot of training data that it can refer to for those types of things. So if we want to pull up the example of what the final result looks like, you actually end up getting a pretty decent prototype. Now, one thing I will say is the models are currently at the point where you can get very solid prototypes and starter templates. Um, this isn't good enough yet to build, huge applications. Obviously, you're not going to build the next Twitter with this, but it's a very good start. And I think these types of prompts show promise long term as the models become more powerful. You'll be able to do a lot more advanced things. But for now, we're at the stage where you can build landing pages, you can build small prototypes, you can build various types of utility apps like a to-do list app, for example. That's a common one I see, and all kinds of different small prototypes that really get the ball rolling. And I think the utility for developers is just getting started, right? If this can get you at least to a prototype stage, then as a developer, you can start iterating on it, making things better. And sometimes the hardest part is getting started. So if this can bootstrap the beginning, it just makes life easier.
Well, the blank page syndrome is an actual thing, isn't it? People do struggle just to get started sometimes. I just love the fact that this entire prompt can be changed completely to build a different app by changing one line in that. Like, to me, that's blowing my mind that we can just change the description, the bit that says a modern web client for Reddit, and it can
Right.
deal with that. I also think that the fact that it brought the APIs in on its own is amazing, because
Yeah.
that is something that I don't know about you, but whenever I'm dealing with APIs, I always have to tut to myself and be like, which type of API is this? How many keys do I need? I, I've dealt with the Spotify API a few times, and every time I look at it, I start to cry because it's just, there's so much to it. But actually, if I could get past all that point and just have a working prototype that I'm customizing, that feels
Right.
much more powerful for developers. And if we look into 10x our workflows, that's got
Yeah.
to be there.
Definitely. It makes life so much easier in terms of getting things off the ground. And if you're the type of person who likes to build different applications and, if you're the type of person who comes up with a lot of ideas, this is amazing because long term, you're going to be able to take those ideas that you have and quickly make prototypes and streamline your process.
So this is the one that you showed me recently, which was the LangChain one you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And what I think is fascinating about this, and maybe you want to talk a little bit about this, is the fact that such a big chunk of your source code is English. And the meme at the moment, isn't it? Is like English is the next new programming language. But given this, that's the way it looks.
Yeah, this is really interesting because this was for a chat application that was built using LangChain. And what you're looking at here is a Python file that contains a huge prompt, basically a paragraph of English. And a lot of users, when they see this for the first time, they think that it's just a comment or something like that. This is actually part of our code because it's part of our prompt template in LangChain. So this English that you're looking at actually has a significant role in the functionality of the application. If you removed this, the application would stop working. So it's crucial. So here we're basically telling it that it's an AI assistant for the open source library LangChain. And basically, we're designing a chatbot that can answer questions from the documentation. And the biggest thing here is if you look at the bottom, we're actually asking the model to not just return plain text. We want it to return Markdown because that helps with formatting. There are all kinds of tricks that we used in here. For example, if you don't know the answer, just say, I'm not sure. Don't try to make up an answer. And we also have a little bit of a security feature where it says if the question is not about LangChain, politely inform them that you are only tuned to answer questions about the library. It's almost hilarious if you think about it, how we're just writing a bunch of English to tell the AI how we want it to give us an output. And a lot of time actually went into making this prompt right. There are trade-offs you have to make. So there's certain trade-offs you have to make. So for example, if you ask it to return in Markdown, it does get a little bit slower, for example. There are certain things where if you give it certain structural requirements, like I want you to give me this output in a very certain way, like JSON or something like that, you'll notice things do end up slowing down. And one of the things that is really important is that you don't make the prompt too long. You have to strike a balance, and it just requires a lot of experimentation to get things right.
What I'm fascinated by in this is, and this is like purely a coincidence, I think, is you've got that line there that says, if the question is not about LangChain, politely inform them that you're tuned to answer questions about LangChain. When I was making an example bot to show like how you could build a chatbot for your company, I just completely pulled out of the ether. If you're asked questions about any other company, don't answer them. Just say you're only going to talk about the company you're dealing with. And
Right.
there's so much similarity in that basic idea. But also, thank you for making a LangChain helper bot, because I think I was moaning to you earlier about how I feel about their docs. But this certainly feels like it's made specifically for me. So thank you.
Yeah, definitely. No problem at all. And this is just the beginning. If you go on Twitter, you'll see a lot of incredible builders taking this technology and building chatbots for a variety of use cases. This one was just for one library, but you can take the same underlying technology and create embeddings for all kinds of things. And it's very, very useful stuff. It's very versatile.
So one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, we joke about the meme that English is the next programming language, but are
Right.
these LLMs optimized for English?
Yeah, from my experience working with these models, it does seem like, for the most part, it's optimized for English. I have experimented with different languages, like Japanese, for example. I've tested a few things. Most of the work I would say that I've done, the vast majority is done in English. But, you know, for the most part, you'll probably get the best results if you're just working with English primarily. Uh, for individuals who don't speak English, you'll probably have to use translation tools if your goal is to get the best possible results. I'm sure you can get away with, prompting in other languages, but really from a if you're reliability standpoint, I think English is the way to go.
Well, we had a look at an example where we literally just translated explain quantum mechanics to us, and we just put it in Google Translate. We got the Japanese, we pasted it in, it answered us in Japanese. We put it back into Google Translate, and it was actually a really nice, concise summary of
Yeah,
particle physics. It's just wonderful that it works that way. But I suppose that the limitations are basically what the model's trained on, and the model presumably is mainly trained in English.
right, right. For the most part, it's going to have English in its trading data. Although, with the newer models that I've been testing, like for example, if you test GPT-4, you'll notice significantly better performance in a variety of different tasks. And I think that Japanese example we did was actually using GPT-4. So, these things are improving significantly every day. And anytime I run into a limitation, my mindset is that it'll be okay within a couple of weeks or months. I try not to get blocked by certain limitations in the models. I'm very optimistic that a lot of the things that I run into that are temporary problems will ultimately go away. And from a strategic standpoint, when you build products or you build any kind of service with AI, uh, do what you can do right now based on the current capabilities, but you can definitely think big and have ambitious goals. But that's just coming from someone who's extremely bullish on the space and optimistic. But we'll see what happens.
I think you're right though, because I have struggled with token lengths as my limiting factor a lot of the times, and the fact that GPT 432K was released just blew my mind that limitation was just removed almost instantly. So before we finish on talking about prompting language models to do language, have you got any top tips for us?
Yeah. So a common trend you'll notice with good prompts is that they always start by setting the stage. You tell the AI to take on a certain role. For example, in some of the examples, it's starting with you are an AI assistant. You could say something like you are a financial analyst who specializes in tracking startups to IPO. You could say, you could give it all kinds of different roles to essentially set the foundation before you actually ask the question. So this works a lot because instead of just directly asking for an output, you first give the model a little bit of context of how they should answer that question. Then you give them the question. And at the end, after you actually give them the query, you can even give certain requirements for the output format. So, for example, you could even tell it to give me the answer in JSON if you wanted to. You could say, give me the answer in Markdown format. That's a common one that I see a lot. Um, and you could even change the language if you wanted to. You could say, give me the output in language. But basically, the common trend here is before you actually ask the question, set the stage with some kind of role that the AI should take on, provide the question, and then at the very end, give it a little bit of a recap on how you want that question exactly to be answered. And this is where real world references can help a lot. For example, if you say, could you generate a news report for me on something? If at the very end, you could even say that news report should be in the style of the Wall Street Journal, for example, because it has knowledge of the Wall Street Journal from its training data, so it can actually tune the response in the exact format and style that you're looking for.
So Zahid, I brought this up because you were tweeting this out recently. And I'll be honest with you, one of the problems I have, I'm very good at prompt engineering for code, very good at prompt engineering for text output, but I totally suck at prompt engineering for images, which is a big disappointment to me. Um, how do we prompt engineer to this level of sophistication with images?
It's so interesting because I would say when most people start out using Stable Diffusion or Dolly, you'll start out with these like really basic images like, show me a panda or something. Like you'll just say like panda eating bamboo or something like that. And there's actually a lot of utility for these diffusion models. Like, for example, one of my favorite use cases is logo generation. So, a fun fact is my past three projects had logos that were generated completely using AI. I used OpenAI Dolly. And the logos, starting with the first one, is basically a symmetrical abstract logo, balanced structure, deep colors. You give it a couple of pointers. The most important thing with image generation, if you're trying to make a good logo, is you have to give it some context of the positioning. And for example, you want to say that the logo should be symmetrical. I find that it's very important to make some kind of reference to symmetry if you want it to look correct. The other thing is you can use different references like, Silicon Valley startup, if that's the kind of vibe that you're looking for in the logo. Uh, but the main thing that's important in this particular context is making a reference to symmetry, things like innovative structure. Now, that's very vague, right? That could be anything. That's because in this example, I was kind of looking for inspiration. I wasn't exactly sure what I was looking for, so I put something very, vague, like innovative structure. But if you had a more specific logo in mind, you could definitely add some detail there. But yeah, for the most part, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, sorry, that's fantastic because like, I would struggle to even define what those shapes are. So that innovative structure modifier, that's
And
what
it,
gives you those interesting shapes. That's
yeah,
fantastic.
you'd be surprised by the results you can get with the right prompt. I've generated so many logos for friends. There's actually a startup that's using one of my logos.
Oh,
It's
wow.
kind of, yeah. So this prompt that I'm showing you right now is very basic. It's a lot better now, but really the main idea, like I said, is just making a couple of key references to the type of output that you want. And also, huge disclaimer: when you use a prompt like this, uh, you're not going to get amazing results every time. Okay, there's a lot of experimentation here. There's definitely a lot of cherry picking when we showcase some of these outputs. Uh, I would say, if you've generated 1,000 logos using AI, you might only like 5 or 10 of them, to be honest with you. But that's the thing. You have to be patient. You have to experiment, optimize your prompt. You might find that certain prompts work better than others. And this is, I think, what you're seeing here is a great example of a very basic prompt that works pretty well for designing awesome logos.
I think that what's interesting about that, and what's worth remembering for all of us, is when we're scrolling Twitter and we see these amazing works of art being generated by things like DALI or Midjourney, they are the cream of the crop. And I like what you said: a few out of 1,000 are the good ones. And I suppose what's good about this is prototyping. It's rapid prototyping of ideas, isn't it? Is that AI gives us the flexibility to rapidly prototype 1,000 logos over a short period of time. Whereas if we pay a graphic designer, 1,000 logos is not only going to take us a long time, but it's going to cost us a lot of money as well.
Definitely. It's great for prototyping. And, I think graphic designers can leverage this for inspiration because you might not even use the logo that the AI generates, but it gives you that initial spark to figure out where you want to go creatively. I think that's a really, important way of looking at it. Um, I think graphic designers can turbocharge their workflows by using stuff like this, just from a creative standpoint, getting ideas. Like you'll get some really awesome outputs that'll maybe take your project in the next direction. So it's important to look at it as a way of not necessarily replacing graphic designers, but augmenting them, making them more efficient and helping them become more powerful in their workflows.
There you go, folks. Replit Pro. We don't only 10x the developers, we 10x the graphic designers as well.
Yep, absolutely.
There's some more stuff you shared with us though, and I think the music here is exciting and interesting. Talk to us a little bit how you prompted it to create music.
Yeah, I've been experimenting with a lot of audio diffusion models. There's a lot of cool models that are coming out. This is actually a field that's very early right now, but things are getting better every single day. I followed the updates very closely. There's a community. There's a model called Dance Diffusion. That's there's a lot of developments happening around that. But the idea here is you can generate pretty awesome music using AI. Again, prototypes, not final results, but you'd be surprised with some of the outputs you can get. Like, for example, one song here called "My Pet Goes from Neptune," which is really random. Honestly, that I wouldn't say that's the best example of a prompt you would give. Ideally, for music generation, you want to make references to real world artists because those artists are actually going to be in the training data, and you also want to make references to certain instruments, right? For some of the examples I've done in the past, besides these playful, fun examples, you'll make references to BPM, beats per minute. Like maybe you want to say, make this song 140 BPM so that it's relatively fast paced. There's different references to, album covers and album uh, titles that various musicians have. And it really helps to just have a pretty solid base knowledge of music in general, and being able to leverage that knowledge to actually craft good prompts.
It feels to me like there are a few takeaways that we can start thinking about now. It's that if you want to generate good quality code, you need to have an understanding of code. If you want to generate the best quality images, you need to have an understanding of artists and art history. And if you want to have the best possibility of generating good music, you need to have a wider appreciation for music. So it feels like that all the fear mongering about AI is actually just empowering people with the knowledge to do more. Now, we've had to listen to this song, and this song is a bit. This song feels a little bit like it could be part of a video game. It's got
Right.
a really interesting sort of sound to it. From your perspective, where do you see these models going for audio in the next few months or few years?
The biggest concern I have is going to be around how these things are going to work legally. Because if you go on Twitter, you'll see a lot of awesome AI generated music that's inspired by like Kanye West, for example. And I'm curious to see how uh, legally things will work with training data that contains certain types of song samples from certain artists and things like that. So I'd be curious to see how it works out. But for now, it seems to be kind of a free for all. So have fun while you can, and we'll see what happens. But generally, I'm really curious to see how things are going to evolve legally. I think that's a big one.
The last thing we wanted to talk about was a really innovative and I think really quite inspirational idea you had about generating things like marketing materials or like calls to action for yourself. Do you want to talk us through this prompt?
Yeah, so one of the things I experimented with recently is generating hypothetical press releases for company IPOs. It's interesting because you can use, because these models are so creative, you can use them to inspire employees, to inspire people in general with hypothetical scenarios, just to give people an idea of how things could work in the future. If, they say that, before you actually achieve something, it helps to visualize it. And if you use AI to, come up with hypothetical goals that you might have, or, milestones that you want to achieve, you can use AI to generate, stories, press releases, different types of reports that you can generate just to give yourself something to look forward to, or to give yourself a way to get inspired. So a company IPO is a interesting one, I think. If you wanted to inspire your employees, you could generate a hypothetical press release. And assuming your company is sufficiently well known and there's training data on it in the models, you could, come up with some really interesting examples, I think.
Well, I tried this yesterday with a completely fictional company that I made up, and
Uh-huh.
it worked really well even for me with my fictional company, just by giving it a few prompt details that were about the sector it was in and things like that.
Right.
So yeah, but I honestly think this is a way to inspire people. It was inspiring to me being able to put something in and be like, I can see a path, I can see an action plan now. So yeah, that's a really great idea. Well done.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you.
So I suppose we'll finish up with our like your final thoughts. Where do you see AI going? Do you see the limitations being overcome sooner rather than later? And what are your thoughts for the future?
Yeah. So one of the things you'll notice in a lot of the examples I showed you is the prompts are very long. I think as these models become smarter, they'll be able to pick up on different cues and context, and you'll be able to get more done with less, I think. Because a lot of the prompts I showed you, it almost seems like you're over explaining certain things and you're giving like way too many hints. And I think the idea is, in the future, you'll be able to say a lot less and it'll just pick things up very quickly. And you'll have to give less specific examples, things like that. That's something I'm looking forward to. I think in the future, your prompts might become shorter because it just understands more. But also, as the capabilities increase, you'll be able to um, get even more value out of the models, and you'll be able to increase your expectations and requirements for what kind of output you want. And that's going to be very interesting as well.
You've got to hope that's the end goal for all these companies because the gold standard would be anybody with zero tech experience talks to one of these models and can generate accurate, detailed, useful output from it.
Right, right. And if you look at it from a chat interface perspective, even if the model cannot generate something in one go, you could always ask follow-up questions. You could do revisions, things like that. So I think that's going to be great as well.
With that in mind, then, let's make sure we record this video again in a few months' time because the pace of change that's happening in the AI industry at the moment is crazy.
Right. It's going to be interesting to see how things evolve. We'll see how this video ages. So yeah, I'm looking forward to recording this again in the future and kind of reviewing things and seeing how things change. It's going to be very interesting.
Zahid, thank you so much for coming on Replit Pro and talking to us about prompt engineering.
Thank you so much for having me.
We hope that everyone will get to see you a lot more in the coming weeks as you're releasing more of your developer focused content. But for us at Replit Pro, that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.